Hey guys, welcome to the R&D show. This is the show with Ryan and Darren. I'm Darren.
And I'm Ryan.
That's true. And what we're going to do is just going to riff on security, talk about what's going on, hot topics, things out in the world, things you probably should know, or maybe you already do, but maybe we want to go a little deeper on. So, one of the big ones that came out that we've had a lot of conversation about, a lot of people have been talking about, is this OMB letter, right, Ryan? People have I don't want to say tension, but there's certainly a lot of attention around what the content is and then what people should do about it. So, what do you think about this thing?
So it's pretty interesting. I mean, this letter did come out in January, and we are about to roll into April. And I think some industry individuals may not have seen it. This is a
Yep.
government notice. But what's really interesting is that they are pushing. The U.S. federal government is pushing their agencies to outline their plan for a zero trust architecture. I'm kind of going to give us. We're going to just make this a real short versus
Wait.
25-page read.
Zero what? Zero
Yeah.
trust
So
architecture?
yeah, zero trust architecture.
Hashtag zero trust architecture. Come to my seminar. What are you talking?
So yeah, so you have to keep me in control because the buzzwords will fly, and I
Just
appreciate
flying.
you
That
bringing me
hashtag got
back.
me right in the middle of the face. What was that?
So with zero trust, this is actually something I think we could say stemmed from Google. Google had done a proof of concept called Beyond Corp, and as they had started building this up as how do we look at securing systems and users interacting with those systems in a different way than some of us old people, where we ran cables and we plugged things into walls and did all those things, and look at it a more modern approach. And you know for a long time it was always going to be this Google dream. Like, this is what our future will be. And then you and I walked around how many trade shows in our time, and we saw zero trust just branded everywhere.
Everybody. Yep, everybody. 3 years before hashtag cloud. But
Yeah.
yes, everywhere.
And it was kind of like, all right, well, who's actually really got a zero trust initiative? And I think that was like zero for at least 3 to 5 years after that whole flood of trade shows.
Hmm.
But now we have the US federal government pushing out, like, we are going to be looking at adopting zero trust architectures. The NIST has done some great documentation and guidance on zero trust. So there's some good resources there.
So take me from the hashtag to reality, right? Like, the problem we had with all those trade shows was people would say it, and then they would give you sort of a generalization of how their company could help you. But when it got down to actually doing something, you didn't feel like you were very much further along. So what is it that or that the government is recommending? What are the steps people are supposed to take?
So right now they are building, well, these agencies have to pick products and solutions that they can see help implement that zero trust architecture. And these are going to be
Okay.
components that will be products that would fall into categories like what we would call, here comes a buzzword, CASB, right, would be one of them. There's products like Netscope, Zscaler, and to the likes that have kind of this CASB proxying control, kind of does a little bit of network monitoring. And there's a lot of up and comers too. So I don't want to discount the startups and everybody else that's coming up with maybe some different approaches. And then you have, well, identity. You and I worked at a company, and then we were at the time saying identity is the new perimeter. Well,
Hmm.
no, identity is the perimeter now. Like, we float around everywhere. And under zero trust, that's even more so, because now you're not doing the old fashioned way of, you jump on this VPN, validate your credentials there, validate when you jump on a system, validate here. And now zero trust is, how are we interacting with these applications? And when you jump from one application to another, did context change for Darren? Did Darren just go to the East Coast via his computer in a 15-minute window? And should we challenge Darren? And there's a couple other methodologies that kind of go into this, where our strength lies, like, is identity, right? We're spending
Hmm.
more on authentication and identity in our space. But there's a lot of other cool tech out there for, like, what Gartner would recommend is CARTA, right? The continuous authentication framework from there. Um, So this is part of zero trust. All these things mashed together to build up zero trust, which is why I think the US federal government finally saying we're going to adopt these things is a pretty big indicator that zero trust has been signed off. It's going to happen now. And maybe because the US federal government's supporting it, we're going to see a lot more private industry start supporting it.
Mm.
But the one problem in this equation is you need to have absolute assurance of that user who's authenticating, because when Darrin gets challenged to authenticate maybe 15, 16 times because of behavior changes, context changes, what kind of experience does Darrin get now?
Yeah, I don't like that. Darrin doesn't like that.
Yeah. Right. So what do we do from a technology standpoint? And the one thing that came out of that OMB was that really stood out. It stood out to HYPR. Why? Because we are huge FIDO advocates. We drive the standard, and we look at what that was to be an industry changing moment. Was FIDO was going to be that standard to change industry. And I think what happened with this OMB, they actually called out FIDO2 phishing resistant MFA, which obviously if people are looking at HYPR, they're going to see it labeled all over our websites.
Sure.
And this is what we strive and live to do. But it's also passwordless.
Yeah. Which, I mean, the cool thing, like just a, simple plug. The cool thing is that we're not a hashtag. We actually do it, but go on.
Well, yeah, no, this is what we do. This is the exciting part.
Yeah.
Imagine being challenged and all you had to do was tap your phone, or you hit your Touch ID or your Windows Hello, and now you actually have a decent user experience, and the security implementation of a zero trust architecture is not impacting the end user, increasing the security profile of a business. All these things end up being like, whoa, dream state. This is great. Like this would be the end goal for these zero trust architectures. And I think really with OMB, and at least with just this message from January, is we have the US government defining that FIDO is VHS and everything else is beta. And that's a reference for some of those older people out there. But in that battle of technology, right? One ends up winning. And I think you experienced it.
It's not okay. Why you got to age me like that? I still have some VHS tapes. They're all Disney movies, but I still have some. I'm not sad. I'm not embarrassed.
Hey, if you relate to it, I made the statement, man. We're both aging each other in this situation. So, but I think it does help, right? Like that means that if the government is making that definition, I think private industry is going to end up looking at following. Because I think there's other things that will happen. And yes, this is a future statement, but look at the pattern. The federal government's going to do some sort of security implementation with zero trust. Well, what's going to happen at the state levels? States are going to go back to their buddies in the federal government, and they're going to say, hey, how are you guys doing this? Like, how did we get there? How did you get there? And they're going to find a way to start mimicking and replicating for success.
Well, in private industry, to your point, going back to Darrin doesn't like that, right? Private industry needs to have that balance of security and usability. That user experience has to be there. And so I think the advances that we get from a government mandated solution also lends itself to people finding solutions for the private industry that people want to use.
Well, yeah. And you basically called it out. Like we end up, how many conversations do we end up having a week on that? It's like, we want MFA, but the user experience sucks.
Yeah.
And we're like, well, we have an MFA, which the user experience doesnn suck. And oh, by the way, we're helping us secure your corporate, resources and eradicating what I will call a toxic asset within an IT environment.
You're calling me a toxic asset. I take that. Shifting gears. So with all of this, right, with all these things, and these security solutions and postures, we still have some pretty nasty folks out there. You look at some of the hacker attacks that have happened. I know for myself, I had a ransomware attack happen on one of my own private home NASs, right? And it's out there, it's prevalent, and they usually are faster. We're usually catching up to the hackers. So you look at the Lapsus recent attack, right? How could that have helped?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Just kind of being someone who's observing, I guess you could say that group of
Hmm.
individuals or organization, however you want to define it. They've had success in a lot of different ways. One thing that stood out the most, and they did a recent information dump, and I don't want to say companies' names on this just
Sure.
because, like, we're we're in an industry where we don't throw stones in glass houses. Like, security is a very hard sport to play, uh, and we all catch black eyes along the way. We have to be on every day and every minute, and that 1 minute that you're not, that is the opportunity for that bad actor,
Hmm.
and they will capitalize. As you were saying, they have finances, they have money, they have resources, and
And
this is what
time.
they get, the time that they just, oh, what are we going to do? So we should never want, we want to make sure that we're constantly building up our community, regardless if it's competitors or not. We're all in this together. Sorry, little preaching moment of community. But what
I
they
almost
did
broke
with
into a little High School Music on that one. Sorry about that. It was in my head though.
so if we look at what they've recently dumped, they dumped a whole bunch of usernames, they dumped a
Hmm.
whole bunch of passwords, which were stored in some spreadsheets, some were stored in a password locker. They had gotten source code to certain things that had some keys. Like, it, it pretty nasty
Yeah.
dump. And the organization they hit had some really important customers that were in this, which basically has a spiraling effect now
Sure.
with incident response for them. And then I sit back and I think about, like, the mission we're on. The
Hmm.
mission we are on is to eradicate passwords and
Sure.
also have MFA. If an organization that was in this situation was to have implemented something like what Hyper has to offer, what would we have been able to mitigate? And I think we would have
Right.
been able to mitigate a lot. But Lapsus is opening up a door to a insider threat problem I don't think we as an industry have really been considering, which is, well, I know Darren's been underpaid for a very long time, and maybe I'll offer him up $10,000 a week in Bitcoin for his credentials. And you start thinking about that, going, wow, there's a reason why government has, top secret clearance. There's a reason why a lot of our financial institutions have really strict background checks on
Hmm.
employees who have access to systems. But, you know, this is spreading out pretty quick, where
Well, and
people are willing.
you and I have talked about it, right? What we do, what our industry does, is part of your solution. It's not the entirety of your solution, and there are multiple vectors that bad actors can try to get in through.
Oh yeah, that, just a simple practices of threat modeling and reviewing your attack surfaces as each organization. I mean, the one thing that we can say is really terrible is that bloody password.
Hmm.
And in trying to even put an MFA over the top of that, which is a password and then maybe another shared secret type password that can be
Yep.
compromised. I mean, what I think it was in 2016, I was at we were hanging out at Black Hat, and people were compromising all sorts of different second factors with, like, webcams presenting RSA tokens, and
Right.
that's how old this was. I mean, 2016, I guess I just dated myself. um the tokens were just being played on a webcam, and SMS has been compromised since I think 2014. Karsten Knowles, thank you for the research, right?
Well,
Just showing
and
that.
the statement was always, "Don't bring your personal phone to Black Hat."
Well, it was Black Hat was in DEF CON, was always that one, a
DEF
little bit more
CON.
aggressive.
Yep.
Black Hat was a little bit more corporate-esque. It's granted put
Still.
on by the same people. But yeah, I mean, just the amount of techniques that could be applied. And don't get me wrong, it's always going to be a moving target. Anything that we do going forward will be someone will start looking at how do they compromise that. And that's the game we're in. Some of us are on defense, a lot of people on offense, and this is what we are tasked with. And a lot of us, I hope, love what we do
Yeah.
and are in for the fight, right? It's definitely a fun challenge, but I think there would have been a lot of mitigation or less IR work having to be done, even for those third parties of that one company that did get recently compromised.
Hmm.
So these other companies have now passwords or possibly access or other things in which they have to investigate. Well, if those companies didn't have passwords and maybe they had something like HYPR in place, then their IR work would maybe be a lot less.
Right. But there's a lot of other resources out there too, right? I mean, it's amazing how the security community has come together and tried to help each other out in ways that you might not have seen in the past. And even the government, we talked about, how the government said, hey, this is what we're going to be doing. You guys should follow it. But there's also CISA and what they're doing. And I know that you've had a lot of kind words about them and what they've been doing to try to help people out.
Yeah, and I'm glad we're going to kind of wrap it a little bit on these guys, because CISA's work, I mean, I've stayed on some calls while they were giving announcements and conversations. It was a 3-hour call with infrastructure companies all over the US. And look, CISA, the FBI, they're all just trying to help build this community more and more and more. And granted, I think it's being accelerated right now
Hmm.
because of the geopolitical and the global environment we're in.
Sure.
Obviously, here in the United States, we're in heightened alert or awareness state because of nation state actors being higher possibilities. They just released a little bit of information from 2011 to 2018 around nation state labeled under Russia, accessing ICS and those type of systems, which is, what, that data for cybersecurity people is awesome, especially in the energy sector, especially in the ICS sector
Yep.
environments. Right now, they can get more indicators of compromise. They can do some better monitoring. They can do things. Now, that is a great component to this community building that CISA is doing, that they're trying to facilitate anything that they can to build this community. And they have a program like Shields Up, which go to CISA.gov, Shields Up, and there are tons of free services for organizations that could get free scans. They can get IP information. There's a wealth of free services that maybe smaller organizations are unaware of. Let the federal government help you out. Now, it could take a little while to get on the list, because what do you get for free services? Usually a backlog of requests. And I did find it very, and I'm going to give a quote. I did find it very interesting that in the conversations, Jen Easterly, who is a CISA director, basically said that her statement was, not all MFA is created equally, but MFA is better than nothing.
Sure.
So for us, obviously, when I hear things like that, it basically comes back to FIDO, passwordless, certificate-based authentications, like PKI, keeping things out. And what I would take from when I hear a quote like that, it makes me warm and fuzzy. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of other people in HYPR that get warm and fuzzy when we hear representative statements like that for the mission that we're on. So
Well,
I
it's
would
certainly validating,
recommend.
right? It's certainly validating.
Definitely validating. So if there's one thing I can give to anybody that may not know us or has kind of walked into this as a newcomer to industry, I strongly recommend go look at CISA.gov and look at Shields Up. There's tons of great info. It's not even just the MFA stuff. Look, the attack vectors, the angles, the insider threat, the ransomware. Well, oh my, like we can basically make a lion, tigers, and bear. Oh my, like there's definitely plenty of things that we have to be concerned with in our field. So
Yeah.
if that's one thing that somebody takes away from this, HYPR's awesome. Oh, and
That's a
CISA is
hashtag.
very
Nice hashtag.
supportive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hashtag
Hashtag
HYPR
hyper
awesome.
is awesome. Awesome. Well, that kind of takes care of this episode of the R&D show. I really, really appreciate anybody who has been watching this. I hope you got some good information out of it. And Ryan, as always, your insight and intelligence is greatly appreciated. Thank you, sir.
Well, I would
And
like to say thank you, Darren, for hanging out with me and having a great conversation, because we could do this all day long. And maybe in the next episode we'll pull some other people in, so it's not just me.
oh
And
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I love hearing you talk, but I'd love to hear someone else. So
yeah.
we'll get some guests in here. Hopefully, somebody who isn't bald, so that we can balance it out a little bit. But thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next time. Thanks, everybody.